But thank you for coming, and we are delighted to have Dr. Amy Ullman. Am I saying your name right? Now, Amy, you're going to have to tell me a little bit. You've got all kinds of degrees, and you teach at Georgetown University. What is it that you teach?
I teach in the law school, 2 seminars, one called Religion and the Work of a Lawyer, and another called Religion, Morality, and Contested Claims for Justice, which I'll talk about.
Okay, so my connection with Amy is through the Focolare movement, so that's how I got to know of her. Those of you who were participating in the book and faith sharing experience that we had last year, Amy was one of the contributors. She contributed one of the chapters in that book, and I was very impressed with that particular chapter, among others. And so we thought that it would be good for her to come, to ask her to come to talk to us about how we as Catholic Christians or Christians could view the polarization in our country. How can we have a positive dialogue even though we might disagree very seriously? So we asked Amy to talk about that, and I think I can turn it over to you.
So first, just a huge thank you for the incredible warm welcome. I'm here with Marianne, who's also together with me in the community house in Silver Spring, and we said we're just going to treat this like a kind of mini vacation, and it has been that. I mean, so restful to come and to celebrate also the beautiful liturgy this morning. In some ways, what I'm going to say is just a footnote to the homily, which was just extraordinarily beautiful. And thank you to each of you for the amazing warm welcome. And so when I bring speakers into my classes, I don't call them guest speakers, I call them conversation partners. And so I hope that's what I can be for you, because I know this is coming into the middle of what is a lively and beautiful conversation here at the Abbey and with the amazing Norbertine community. And so I'm really honored to come into this space and into your ongoing conversation. And so I'll offer a few ideas, and then hopefully we'll have some time also for some discussion, or just to continue as food for thought for further discussion. So I've entitled this "The Beatitudes: A Path to Positive Political Dialogue." And so even just saying positive political dialogue, you're like, yeah, all right. so let's it's impossible, right? And so let's make it more personal and go back to this idea of coming together around a meal and people who otherwise die if they don't join the table, right? We're coming right up against what? Thanksgiving, right? Thanksgiving is around the corner. And at least in my family, the questions are very serious. Are we going to be able to sit at the same table with Uncle Bob or with my niece Sarah, right? Or forget about what my grandchildren are thinking or what my great-grandchildren are thinking. They're like from another planet, right? And so what does it mean to think about coming together with people who may be on the opposite side of the political spectrum, especially after our most recent Facebook exchange, right? And so the ways in which also social media has been complicating our lives. So in many ways and in many aspects, our political life seems to be a long way off from beatitude. Yet we have in the spring 2018 apostolic exhortation from Pope Francis, Gaudete and exultate, rejoice and be glad. Pope Francis encourages us to take up the Beatitudes in every aspect of our daily lives. He writes, everything can be accepted and integrated into our life in this world and even becomes a part of our path to holiness. We are called to be contemplatives in the midst of action. Even in politics, even in the midst of political tensions, So I work in Washington, D.C. It's a little town down the block from here. And I work at a law school campus which is located 12 blocks from the White House and 6 blocks from the U.S. Capitol. Every morning I walk into the building and the shadow of the Capitol greets me as I come into the building where I teach. And so I just wanted to give you a little snapshot as we start, just to say this is not a naive kind of engagement, a little snapshot of how difficult things have become in the past couple of years. So with this latter seminar that I mentioned, Religion, Morality, and Contested Claims for Justice, the goal of the seminar is to help students talk about politics without killing each other. That's the stated goal, to develop the communication skills they need. And so what happened, the last time I taught it, you can pray for me, I'm going to teach it again in the spring. But the last time I taught it in the fall of 2018, just to give you an idea of the challenge, we attempted to hold a conversation about migration on the morning of the Kavanaugh hearing. And so the aggravation and the irritation in the room could be cut with a knife, with a big, thick knife. And so when I hear the invitation of Pope Francis, rejoice and be glad, I'm like, are you kidding? More like weep and gnash your teeth. This is really, really hard. So what might it mean to think about applying the Beatitudes in a setting like this? So we're going to come back to this. I realize I'm leaving you with this kind of cliffhanger, but we'll come back to this. I'd like to look at what this looks like in light of some of the specific Beatitudes. So we have, for example, blessed are the meek, blessed are the merciful. How on earth can these be reconciled with blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness? So those who have this ministry of reconciliation, right? How are we going to do this, right? This is really, really hard. So personally, as an attorney, trained as an attorney, I am most at home with a hunger and thirst for righteousness, which could also be translated as justice. So the Pope writes, hunger and thirst are intense experiences since they involve basic needs and our instinct for survival. There are those who desire justice and yearn for righteousness with a similar intensity, and we can cooperate to make that possible. The Pope cautions against giving up on the fight for real justice and puts a spotlight on justice for those who are most vulnerable. All of this sounds terrific. But I think many of my students run into trouble when we try to put this together with the commentary on Blessed are the meek. Pope Francis reflects, meekness is another expression of the interior poverty of those who put their trust in God alone. Indeed, the Bible uses the same word, anawim, usually referring to the poor and the meek. And someone might object in saying, if I'm meek, they're going to steamroll me, right? They will think that I'm an idiot or a fool or a weakling. And the Pope says, at times that may be, but so be it. It's always better to be meek, for then our deepest desires will be fulfilled. We're not there yet, right? This is tough. So as I look around our world and our culture, I see much to challenge. Not only on behalf of my partial and particular interests, I'm not just fighting for myself, but in the cause of justice toward those who are most vulnerable. As an attorney and as a teacher helping to train future attorneys, we are not generally arguing for our personal interests, but for those of another person. So it's one thing for me to be meek regarding my own interests, and it's quite a different story to ask another person, and including one whom I represent, to assume an attitude of meekness. So I am drawn, when I read the Pope's message, to the seemingly paradoxical nature of the challenge. The Beatitudes seem to be riddled with impossible tensions. Whose claims for justice should win? At what point do meekness and mercy simply enable chaos or bad behavior that law and public policy should address? pick any topic, we seem to be paralyzed by the difficulty of resolving these polarities that also involves serious injustice. So, what might it mean for mercy and truth to meet, for justice and peace to kiss? So, I'm going to pull back from this tension for a moment, but I promise we're going to resolve everything by the end. You believe me, right? We're going to resolve it all. We're going to resolve it by the end. So, let's see if we can get some help from exploring the creative tension between another pair. Blessed are the poor in spirit, theirs is the kingdom. And blessed are the pure of heart, they shall see God. They shall see, and this is the footnote to the homily this morning. What does it mean to have a pure vision? What does it mean to see clearly right now? And, this is the hard part, when you feel that you have a clear sense of direction for where we should be headed as a policy, doesn't it make you want to push that agenda along just a little bit, right? I feel that. Right? Isn't it especially hard to have poverty of spirit when you are convinced and convicted of the necessity of helping others catch even a glimpse of the pure vision? In fact, we might feel that any slack in the reins of arguments might be perceived as an unacceptable compromise with evil. What does it mean to be true to our values and at the same time open to others who think differently? How can we learn to welcome and even talk about the difficult and most painful questions without being afraid that there will be a misunderstanding or an explosion? So here I'd like to highlight an important distinction in church teaching and see if it can't help us open up some space. The book on A Positive Vision of Politics opens this out more completely, but this is just a snapshot. It's the distinction between identifying values and principles as points of reference and discussing their application in politics and public policy. They're of course related, but we can distinguish for a moment the two. So let's take a concrete example. Prostitution. I think there is pretty deep agreement within the Catholic tradition that it is bad. But the primary vehicle for addressing this problem, what should it be? The criminal law? More effective to work at a cultural level? At an economic level, from the perspective of health and drug abuse policy? What combination of these solutions? The fact that we are discussing various kinds of solution and may even disagree about those policy solutions and the right combination does not mean that someone thinks prostitution is a great idea. So there's room for debate on the application, even if we agree on the principle. So the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith issued a note in 2002, which is still good. We're used to thinking if something is 2002, it's like, oh, that's ancient history. But this is still good, still very effective teaching, which describes the kind of room, and it talks about distinguishing between two kinds of pluralism. So, on the level of concrete political action, there can generally be a plurality of political parties in which Catholics may exercise through legislative assemblies the right and duty to contribute to the public life of their country. There is room for more than one party in the Catholic Church. And this arises because of the changing and contingent nature of the choices that we have for ordering our society, the strategies for guaranteeing or accomplishing the same fundamental value. When it comes to values, the teaching holds that a pluralism of options on the political level should not be confused with an ambiguous pluralism in the choice of moral principles or essential values. Some actions are always wrong, but Every single action requires some practical analysis on the question about how society should deal with a particular evil. We need the political process to work through what to do about any given evil, how to reduce it, and how every person is treated with dignity and respect as we're managing these problems. Because it's not immediately clear, and differences of opinion are legitimate, appropriate, and perhaps even helpful. So if we would like to be simultaneously rooted in church teaching and open to the world's suffering and questions, how much room is there for discussion? A heck of a lot. And this is obviously because our discussions are not just about identifying values. They are also about the human drama and the challenge or the suffering of trying to live according to these values, the need for a community to live in this way, and debates about the best road into social change. So when there is that agreement at the Thanksgiving table, when there is that disagreement at the Thanksgiving table, we hope there's some agreement, maybe about the turkey, maybe about the mashed potatoes, right? There's some agreement, right? But when there is some disagreement, one initial question might be to ask, what kind of disagreement are we having? Is it really on the level of values? It might be. This is not to discount that there are those kinds of disagreements as well. But to say, is it really on the level of values? Or is it about how to travel toward making those values a reality in our society? So I have the impression that many times, especially in our Catholic communities, I'll say just as a kind of starting point, many times what is happening in political conversations is that people are speaking on two tracks. And so some are speaking on the level of values, trying to identify values clearly. Blessed are the pure of heart, right? And others are struggling with the practical questions surrounding how to resolve certain problems or evils in our society. Obviously they're related, but they're different tracks. And so it's like trains that never meet each other. So here's an image that might be helpful in terms of appreciating this. It's like a group of hikers. One part of the team is focused on the compass, which gives an accurate but fairly general sense of direction. Another part of the team has a topographical map that has carefully marked out the paths that are closed due to rock slides or other obstacles. So what happens in the conversation when there are these two different mechanisms for understanding what direction to go? Often what sneaks into the dynamic is a layer of distrust, which expresses itself like this. The reason the topographical crowd does not want to forge through this rock pile is because they really don't want to travel westward. And they are trying to find every possible way to slow up our journey. That's the distrust and perhaps also the fear. Or the real reason that the compass-obsessed want to force us through this rock pile is because in their heart of hearts, they do not care about the weaker hikers, and they want to weed them out of our group. So, blessed are the pure of heart, those who pay deep and constant attention to the compass, because we are called to be clear-eyed about values and principles. But blessed also are those who are attentive to the concrete problems on the ground, who work to solve those problems. So in some ways, going back to the homily this morning, and for those who might not have been there, this question of what we see then informs how we approach our world. So when we see that we are actually linked as the body of Christ through the unity generated by the Eucharist, when we see that there is that deep connection, and we realize that we might be talking on different tracks or working on different problems, trying to solve different issues, but we can see that underneath there's like a root structure that connects us as a people and as a body, and it's flowering in different ways in the church. But we can see the unity that's underneath. It's then, I think, that we can intuit our way through some of these tensions. So what might it mean to be poor in spirit as we converse with each other on how to travel toward the kingdom? In my class, before we talk about abortion, we do a brief exercise that's called, "What is at stake for you?" So I ask the students to pair off with a person that they don't know well and to ask each other, what is at stake for you in this conversation? And what worries you most as we enter into this conversation? So before we get into it, right, to recognize each other in that moment. They have then one index card between two people. They jot down a few notes based on their conversation, and I tell them, I know this is so cheesy, but I say, hold that card. Hold what you have shared together in this moment as we traverse into this difficult territory. And it's really amazing. I mean, it changes the room completely. It changes the temperature in the room in the sense that the heat of the fear of what we're going to encounter goes down, but there's a kind of warmth in having had that possibility to recognize each other, to be received by the other person in your concerns and your worries. And that can make a huge difference in a conversation. I'm not suggesting that you bring index cards to the Thanksgiving table, but but you might want to try it. I mean, you never know if little index cards can be helpful, but sometimes that moment of exchange, or even just asking, what is at stake for you? What worries you? That moment of recognition can make a big difference. So at this point, I'm going to now make up a beatitude. Is that okay if I make up a beatitude? Okay. Because I think it's an important corollary to blessed are the peacemakers. So here it is. Blessed are they who slow down. Many of us, I think, are fatigued by cultural interactions that feel increasingly rude and coarse and inconsiderate. And these are further poisoned by fake news or accusations of fake news or outright lies. But the artificiality of echo chambers that are always cushioned, I think, is no more attractive. So amid these challenges, and I'm just so happy to be here in this space of prayer as I say this, I am drawn to the work of paying deep attention to the interior life. I find that my own anxieties about communication with others are often quelled or even healed when I consistently take quiet time that I need to meditate, reflect, and pray. And it is there that I find the insight and energy to be a peace builder. In teaching, I notice a similar shift. When the students take time to write and reflect before we come into our conversations, they can own what they're thinking with more depth. And so there's this interesting correlation between the time that we take to gather our own thoughts and our openness to receiving the sincere thoughts of the others who might be different. So Pope Francis highlighted this dimension beautifully in this letter. He says, "We are overwhelmed with words, by superficial pleasures and increasing din, filled not by joy, but rather by the discontent of those whose lives have lost meaning. How can we fail to realize the need to stop this rat race and recover the personal space needed to carry on a heartfelt dialogue with God? Finding that space may prove painful, but it is always fruitful. Sooner or later, we have to face our true selves and let the Lord enter. We need to claim this time for heartfelt dialogue. We need to find that still point of interior peace, the peace that emerges from a conversation with God in order to be peacemakers in the world. In fact, I would submit that one of the greatest obstacles to discerning next steps in the midst of a polarized society is the sense that we need to provide immediate answers to situations, questions, to all of our cultural problems. Time is up. Our patience has run out. But the Pope writes, if we are constantly upset and impatient with others, we will end up drained and weary. Is that true? Yes, I think that's true. So let me make a distinction. The problems that we're talking about are urgent, are terribly urgent, and in many ways. But I think what we're struggling with right now is excessive reactivity, the kind that leads to hastily scribbled tweets and posts and even reports without taking the time to check the accuracy of facts and assumptions. So I recently came across a text from 1546 that helped me to appreciate the long-standing nature of the communication challenges in our church. And it's called On Dealing with Others, and it's an instruction from St. Ignatius of Loyola to the Jesuits who were assigned as theologians to the papal legates presiding over the Council of Trent. It's comforting to know we're not the first to face this, right? There's long-standing challenges. And so after a brief introduction, the first words of Ignatius's recommendation, guess what they are? Be slow to speak, right? Even in 1546, he's saying, slow down, right? Here's what he writes. It's a beautiful text. Be slow to speak. Be considerate and kind, especially when it comes to deciding on matters under discussion or about to be discussed in the council. He then repeats, be slow to speak, and only after having first listened quietly so that you may understand the meanings and leanings and wishes of those who do speak. Thus you will better know when to speak and when to be silent. It's a great text, right? I taped it to my computer. It's really... So for example, in law and politics, I think in many jobs, few roles actually require an immediate reactive response. A substantial pause is almost always helpful in the process of thoughtful evaluation, and also thinking about the way a response might express respect for the human dignity of every person wrapped up in a crisis or a story or an event. St. Ignatius's instruction to listen quietly opens out a space, for me, far beyond simply not talking over the other person. In my experience, often the most disturbing noise that impedes the reception of the other's reality is not how my mind is cluttered with what I want to say in response, but my tendency to place that person into categories that are too restrictive to fully understand them. So to listen quietly is to cultivate a charitable, open spirit that recognizes how much work it takes to understand the meanings, leanings, and wishes of those who speak. So another exercise that we do, actually, in this we've done in community work with the Focolare, which embraces left and right, and we do struggle with polarization within our communities. The goal of the community is working for unity, and so it just breaks our heart that we are in the midst of this struggle. You know, we're people who wake up in the morning saying, how can I build unity in the world? And then we find ourselves in these small group, communities fighting with each other about politics. And so it's like impossibly difficult. And so we started a few years ago these workshops called Citizens for United World, and workshops aimed at helping us as a community learn these kinds of communication skills. So we started doing that in a community setting, and now I bring them into the classroom. Sometimes teachers work out things in the academy and then bring them into the community, but I've done the reverse, right? And so informed my teaching with some of these community exercises. And so this exercise that we do is called Listening to Understand, and it gets people out of a debate mode so that when I'm listening, I have all my debate points, and I'm going to stock them here, here, and here. And it's hard for lawyers not to do this, right? Because you think of all the arguments that you want to say, and you're there taking notes about what the other person is saying. You're like, okay, here's the weaknesses, right? And I'm going to get them here, 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 and here, right? Okay, what does it mean mean Amy, calm down, right? What does it mean to listen, to understand, not to debate? And so giving the person a chance to express themselves in their own words, not in the words that I would like to hear from them, right? Express themselves in their own words, and then repeat back, kind of echo back, here's what I understood. Not to argue, just to only for the purpose of understanding, and then give the person who has explained their position a chance to, correct you, right? To say, oh, well, actually, your filter is obfuscating what I was actually trying to say. And so that openness to also correction, to understanding deeply. And so when I've done this exercise in the community and with students, and we do a little kind of feedback moment, what's so beautiful is two impressions. One is, oh my gosh, I realize how rarely do I listen like this. And I need to go and try this with my boyfriend or with my husband or with my son. And then the second impression is the experience of being received by another person, not in order to counter them, but this sense of feeling like you are taken in, you are received in love, hopefully, and the experience of being received in that way can be tremendously healing. So, poverty of spirit, blessed are the poor in spirit in how we engage in these conversations. Why are we blessed? It's because it leaves room, I think, for the Holy Spirit to then come into our conversations, not only as a guide, but as a healing kind of balm. So what else happens when we slow down? Often I find that slowing the pace makes me open and receptive to appreciate what is going on with other people, including and especially when they are suffering. So the Beatitude, blessed are those who mourn. And again, this is another footnote to the homily, I mean, in a very kind of existential way. So when my students are tempted to go immediately for the jugular of an argument with which they disagree, I invite them to think of the argument as like a box and then draw a circle around it, draw like a circumference, and to explore the factors and intentions and pressures that may have led the other person to that stance. What is bearing down on the person who holds that argument? Has anyone here seen or listened to the music of Hamilton? Yeah. Okay. So there's a scene in Hamilton toward the end after Alexander has just made a disaster of his marriage in many ways, and they've suffered the tragedy. Spoiler alert! Sorry, the son dies. They have suffered the tragedy of the loss of their son, and they're trying to put their marriage back together. And they move uptown. And there's a song, I've heard it 50 times, and I like sob every time I hear it. It's really just beautiful, called "It's Quiet Uptown." And so it's this kind of quiet space where they're trying to rebuild their relationships. And so here's the line that I bring to the classroom. It says, if you see him in the street, walking by himself, talking to himself, have pity. He is working through the unimaginable. So what might be the hidden unimaginable that informs another person's argument or attitude? What kinds of pressures are bearing down on what they say or do? How might empathy for the unimaginable inform my response, including my decision to forward a news story or a post or interact on social media? The divisions of a polarized society can leave people feeling isolated, like they are walking by themselves and talking to themselves. So amidst heated discussion, I think it is helpful to stop and ask ourselves, who is at the heart of these debates? Isn't it often a person or a group of people who have in some way been wounded? Do I think about the persons who are suffering because of these issues with the same love that I would hope to have for a wounded Jesus on the cross? Is my perspective on political issues grounded in an effort to love by entering into and living inside as much as possible, living inside of these wounds, taking them on as my own? So let's go back to this image of the hikers. And we have a group on a hiking expedition. And we have some helpful markers in our tradition of what is always wrong, what are intrinsic evils. So what are these markers? They are like a guardrail. The guardrail, though, does not preclude discussion about what to do when somebody slips over the edge. It does not preclude the effort that fellow travelers can and will and should make to pull up those who have fallen into a ravine. And the guardrail is neither the path nor the goal of the journey. It's there to help us. But how we interact with when things go wrong in a community, or when things go wrong in somebody's life, or when things go wrong in the world, right? There's lots of room to explore how to work together in those situations. So take, for example, a woman who is struggling with the financial, physical, emotional demands of an unplanned pregnancy. Through those eyes that see all of the connections, the woman facing these circumstances is a part of me, just as much as the child within her. So, through this lens, one may share the joyful hope of a new life, but also the worries and uncertainties and pressures of the economic burdens and social expectations which can make it difficult to welcome the responsibility of a new child. Blessed are the merciful. Another image. Teacher, this woman has been caught in the act of adultery, and now the law of Moses commands us to stone such. What do you say about her? Jesus did not equivocate on the content of the moral law or the fact that the woman's conduct was sinful. He said, "Neither do I condemn you. Go and do not sin again." But this was only after she had experienced his unconditional love and mercy. Neither do I condemn you. There was a television miniseries called Jesus many years ago in 2000. And Mary Magdalene summed up the scene. She says, "You treated her like she was worth something." When we recognize suffering as a springboard to love, we can hope to embody individually and as a community the living presence of Christ, that connective root structure, that being the body of Christ, that brings to each person not only the clarity of moral truth, but also the personal courage to walk along his way and to experience that consequent joy and beauty. For all who struggle deeply with the moral questions of our day, this living presence of Christ can become a transformative encounter with the justice of Jesus, which is also love and mercy and grace. Blessed are those who mourn. Pope Francis reflects, the world tells us to avert our gaze from suffering. The world has no desire to mourn. It would rather disregard painful situations, cover them up, or hide them. And much energy is expended on fleeing from the situations of suffering in belief that this reality can be concealed, but the cross can never be absent. In my experience, the young adults that I accompany in my teaching and community work are aching for the kinds of relationships and social spaces where they can be sincere about their own limits and sorrows. There's skyrocketing levels of anxiety and depression in teenagers and young adults, and many are struggling to break free from the paralyzing fear of failure or excessive concerns about appearances. Blessed are those who mourn, also to our young people. So let's return to our cliffhanger, as I promised. You were waiting for this, right? Okay. So how can we bring together gospel-based commitment to justice, our hunger and thirst for justice, with evangelical meekness and mercy? What might be the touchstone to ensure that invocations of hunger and thirst for justice do not tip into arrogant condemnation of others? Or, on the other side, that calls for meekness and mercy do not devolve into vicious enabling of injustice and sinful practices and structures. What might help us to discern when to speak with boldness and when to be patient and silent? In some circumstances, I think these poles come together precisely in this beatitude. Blessed are those who mourn. So in the class, that same class that I started with, the class I taught last fall, in the midst of the intense political polarization, we were well into the semester when the kind of click, when a class starts to trust each other and have those really good conversations, that was nowhere in sight. And so what I did at that point is go into a quiet church and put myself in front of the Blessed Sacrament. And I said, Jesus, if the class does not gel this semester, I am ready for that. But if it does, I will receive it as your gift. So what happened? 2 weeks later, we were discussing euthanasia, and the readings included reflections on how depression and mental illness might be factors in a person's decision-making. At the beginning of the semester, one of the students had shared with me that his mother, who had been fighting breast cancer for almost a decade, had gone into hospice care. A young guy, 25, so his mom was also not that old. The day of that class, the student was present, and I knew that his mother had died the week before. And the rest of the class did not know this. So what happened? This student, it was incredible, dug so deep and shared with the class his own perspective on accompanying his mother to the moment of her death. Spurred on by his courage, others gave their colleagues a glimpse of how their own struggles with depression or anxiety had had an impact on their own decision-making. None of this was inappropriate oversharing. It wasn't problematic in how it was shared. So when my student was able to vulnerably share his own capacity to mourn and to let his seminar colleagues into that space of mourning, our class came together as a group, forging a bond of trust that remained strong throughout the semester. And I went back to that church like the leper who had been healed in gratitude for the gift we had received. Pope Francis, this is really the complement to also what we reflected on this morning in the liturgy. He reflects, a person who sees things as they truly are and sympathizes with pain and sorrow is capable of touching life's depths and authentic happiness. I would say this is the person who truly sees. He or she is consoled not by the world, but by Jesus. Such persons are unafraid to share in the sufferings of others. They do not flee from painful situations. And here we could have Isaiah 58 and the Bethesda Project and those who are working with the homeless in Philadelphia. I mean, I bet half the room is going to stand up if we say, those who do not flee. I feel like I'm looking at those who do not flee from painful situations. They discover the meaning of life by coming to the aid of those who suffer, understanding their anguish and bringing relief. They sense that the other is flesh of our flesh and are not afraid to draw near, to even touch their wounds. They feel compassion for others in a way that all distance vanishes. So I think we can ask for the grace to be, it's a grace, it's a gift. I mean, there's no other way to describe it. I think to ask for the grace to be open so that the healing Spirit of God can enter into and illuminate every tension. I think wherever there's a living Christian community, we can ask for this grace. And in this way, the distances that we're experiencing in polarization will vanish, not because we're trying hard, not because of our own efforts, but because of that healing presence of God's presence. So I'd like to conclude with a prayer that Thomas Merton wrote shortly before his death. He wrote, "O God, we are one with you. You have made us one with you. You have taught us that if we are open to one another, you dwell in us. Help us to preserve this openness and to fight for it with all our hearts." This is me. In our frenetic world, when we fight to cultivate a sense of interiority, which in turn helps us to see others as flesh of our flesh, we also invite into our lives and our relationships a presence of love. You dwell in us, which can in turn help us to be for the world a people of the Beatitudes. Thank you so much for your attention.